September 23rd, 1803. Dawn breaks over the dusty plains of central India, and the most audacious military gambit in British colonial history is about to unfold. A single British officer stands at the head of a ragtag force of barely 2,800 men, half of them untested Indian sepoys, the other half exhausted European soldiers who haven't seen home in years. Before them stretches an enemy army of over 30,000 battle-hardened warriors, supported by French artillery and led by one of the most feared military commanders on the subcontinent. The odds are roughly 11-1 against survival, let alone victory. Picture this moment. You're standing in that British commander's boots, feeling the weight of impossible mathematics pressing down on your shoulders. Your men are outnumbered more than 10-1. Your supply lines are stretched thin across hostile territory. Your political superiors back in Calcutta have already written off this expedition as a costly mistake. The enemy forces arrayed against you include some of the finest cavalry in India, artillery trained by French experts, and infantry that has never known defeat on these plains. What would you do? Most reasonable military minds would order an immediate retreat, cut losses, preserve what forces remain for a more favorable engagement, live to fight another day when the mathematics of war might smile more kindly upon British arms. But the man commanding those 2,800 souls wasn't most military minds. His name was Arthur Wellesley, and though history would eventually crown him the Duke of Wellington, the man who broke Napoleon at Waterloo, in 1803 he was just another company officer in his early 30s, largely unknown outside military circles, carrying the hopes of British India on his shoulders, and he was about to pull off one of the most brilliant tactical victories in military history. This is the story of the Battle of Assai, an engagement so audacious in conception and devastating in execution that it would fundamentally alter the balance of power across the Indian subcontinent. It's the story of how mathematical impossibility became strategic genius, how a forgotten colonial skirmish shaped the destiny of empires, and how one man's tactical brilliance saved British rule in India from potential collapse. You need to understand something about the world of 1803. While Napoleon was reshaping Europe and Britain fought for its very survival against French hegemony, another equally consequential struggle was playing out across the sun-baked plains and jungle-covered hills of India. The Maratha confederacy, a loose alliance of powerful Hindu kingdoms, controlled vast swaths of central and western India, representing perhaps the last serious indigenous challenge to British expansion on the subcontinent. The Marathas weren't just another collection of feudal princes armed with medieval weapons. These were sophisticated military powers that had learned from their European enemies, adopting modern artillery, disciplined infantry formations, and, most dangerously, French military advisors who brought with them the tactical innovations that were revolutionizing warfare across the globe. At the heart of this Maratha resurgence stood Daulat Rao Scindia, the Maharaja of Gwalior, a ruler whose ambitions stretched across northern India and whose military forces represented a direct threat to British interests from Bengal to Bombay. Scindia had done something that struck terror into the hearts of East India Company administrators. He had professionalized his army. Gone were the days when European discipline and firepower could automatically overwhelm larger but poorly organized Indian forces. Scindia's battalions drilled in European fashion, his artillery was served by French-trained gunners, and his cavalry, already legendary for their mobility and courage, now operated in coordination with infantry and guns in the modern combined arms style that had made French armies masters of Europe. This was the enemy that Britain faced in 1803, and the stakes could not have been higher. The Second Anglo-Maratha War had begun earlier that year, sparked by a complex web of political alliances, territorial disputes, and the simple reality that the Indian subcontinent wasn't large enough for both British expansion and Maratha independence. The East India Company, already stretched thin by wars against Tipu Sultan in the south and persistent conflicts along the frontier, now faced the prospect of a coordinated Maratha assault that could potentially drive British forces into the sea. Governor-General Richard Wellesley, Arthur's older brother, had crafted an ambitious strategy to deal with this threat. Rather than wait for the Marathas to unite their forces and choose the time and place of battle, British forces would strike first, hitting the Confederacy before it could fully mobilize. It was a bold plan that required precise timing, superior intelligence, and commanders willing to take extraordinary risks. Arthur Wellesley commanded the northern prong of this offensive, tasked with neutralizing Scindia's forces while other British columns dealt with his allies. But from the moment the campaign began, nothing went according to plan. The rains that year had been catastrophic, turning rivers into torrents and roads into quagmires. Supply convoys bogged down in mud. Disease ravaged the ranks faster than enemy action. Intelligence reports proved contradictory and unreliable. By late September, Wellesley found himself deep in hostile territory, his force reduced by illness and desertion, facing an enemy army that had grown stronger, while his own had grown weaker. This is where most generals would have reconsidered their options. The prudent course was obvious: fall back to more favorable ground, await reinforcements, perhaps seek a negotiated settlement that would preserve British face while acknowledging Maratha strength. But Arthur Wellesley had studied the mathematics of empire, and he understood something that his more cautious colleagues did not. In colonial warfare, perception often mattered more than reality. A British retreat, even a tactical one, would signal weakness to every potential ally and enemy across India. Native princes who had remained neutral would throw their lots in with the Marathas. British prestige, that invisible but crucial foundation of colonial rule, would crumble. Sometimes, he realized, you had to gamble everything on a single throw of the dice. The intelligence that reached Wellesley's camp on September 22nd painted a stark picture. Scindia's main army, commanded by Colonel Anthony Pohlmann, a German mercenary in Maratha service, had taken up positions near the village of Assai, roughly 60 miles northeast of Aurangabad. The enemy force consisted of approximately 30,000 infantry, organized into disciplined battalions, 40,000 cavalry that could strike like lightning across the open plains, and over 100 pieces of artillery, including some of the finest guns in India. Pohlmann himself was no mere adventurer seeking fortune in foreign service. A former non-commissioned officer in the Hanoverian army, he had spent years studying European military science and adapting it to Indian conditions. His battalions were drilled to Prussian standards, his artillery positioned with geometric precision, and his battle plans crafted with the methodical thoroughness that had made Germanic military science the envy of Europe. Against this formidable array, Wellesley could field barely 2,800 men. His force consisted of the 74th Highland Regiment, the 78th Highland Regiment, 8 companies of sepoys from various native battalions, a handful of British officers, and exactly 17 pieces of artillery. No cavalry to speak of, no reserves worthy of the name, no realistic hope of reinforcement should the battle go badly. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. Pohlmann's army outnumbered Wellesley's by more than 10 to 1 in infantry, possessed an overwhelming advantage in cavalry, and fielded 6 times as many guns. Any textbook analysis would have concluded that the British force faced certain annihilation, but textbooks don't account for genius. That evening, as Wellesley studied his maps by candlelight in his tent, he was conducting calculations that went far beyond simple arithmetic. Yes, he was outnumbered. Yes, his position was precarious, but he had identified something in the enemy deployment that others had missed. A tactical opportunity so subtle and so dangerous that only a commander of extraordinary vision would even consider exploiting it. The Maratha army had positioned itself between 2 rivers, the Kaitna and the Jua, with the village of Assai anchoring their right flank. It was a strong defensive position that protected them from flanking attacks and provided multiple escape routes should retreat become necessary. Pohlmann had chosen his ground. Well, creating a killing field where British forces would be forced to attack across open terrain into the teeth of massed artillery. But there was a flaw in this seemingly perfect position. A single flaw that Wellesley had spotted through careful reconnaissance and that he intended to exploit with surgical precision. The two rivers converged at a sharp angle just beyond the Maratha left flank, creating a narrow peninsula of dry ground. If, and it was an enormous if, an attacking force could cross the Kaitna River undetected and strike at this junction point, they could potentially split the enemy army in half, separating the infantry from the cavalry and creating the kind of confusion that might, just might, offset the massive numerical disadvantage. It was an insanely risky plan. Crossing a river in the face of the enemy violated every principle of military science. The narrow frontage would limit the number of troops that could engage simultaneously, negating any advantage from superior European discipline. If the attack failed, if the river crossing was detected, if the assault stalled, if Pohlman reacted more quickly than anticipated, the entire British force would be trapped against the water and destroyed piecemeal. But if it succeeded, Wellesley called his senior officers together that night for what would become one of the most famous councils of war in military history. Picture that scene. A handful of weathered soldiers gathering around a campaign table in a canvas tent, studying maps by flickering candlelight, while the sounds of an enormous enemy army drifted across the darkness. These men had followed their commander across thousands of miles of hostile territory, had watched their ranks thin from disease and desertion, had seen the odds stacked ever more heavily against them. Now their general was proposing to bet everything on a single, desperate gambit. Colonel Maxwell of the 78th Highland Regiment was the first to speak. A veteran of campaigns in Flanders and Egypt, he had seen enough warfare to recognize both brilliance and madness. "Sir," he said carefully, "the mathematics are challenging." Wellesley nodded. He had no intention of minimizing the risks or offering false comfort. "The mathematics are indeed challenging, Colonel. But consider this. If we retreat now, we lose the campaign. If we attack conventionally, we lose the battle. This plan offers us the only chance, however slim, of achieving something that changes the strategic picture entirely." Major John Malcolm, the political officer attached to the expedition, leaned forward. "What about our sepoys? Will they hold under this kind of pressure?" It was a crucial question. The East India Company's Indian troops had proven their worth in numerous engagements, but they had never faced odds like this. European observers still harbored doubts about native reliability when the going got truly desperate. If the sepoy battalions broke at the critical moment, the entire attack would collapse. Wellesley's response revealed the depth of his understanding of the men under his command. "Our sepoys have marched with us across 200 miles of enemy territory. They have endured everything we have endured, suffered everything we have suffered. They know that retreat means acknowledging defeat before the battle even begins. I believe they would rather die as soldiers than live as failures." The discussion continued deep into the night, covering every aspect of the proposed assault. Timing, river crossings, artillery deployment, command structures if senior officers fell, contingency plans if the attack stalled, signals for retreat if everything went wrong. But as the hours passed, something remarkable happened. The initial skepticism gave way to grudging admiration for the plan's audacity, then to genuine enthusiasm for its possibilities. These were professional soldiers who understood that conventional tactics offered no hope of victory. If they were going to fight, and retreat was no longer an option, then they might as well fight with a plan that offered at least the possibility of stunning success. By dawn, the decision was made. The British force would cross the Kaitna River and assault the junction of the two rivers where the Maratha line was thinnest. They would stake everything on surprise, speed, and the hope that disciplined European troops could punch through enemy lines before numerical superiority could be brought to bear. The morning of September 23rd dawned clear and hot, with the kind of crystalline visibility that makes every detail of the landscape stand out in sharp relief. Wellesley spent the early hours conducting final reconnaissance, studying the enemy positions through his telescope and confirming the details of the river crossing that would determine the fate of his entire force. The Kaitna River at this point was perhaps 50 yards wide, flowing slowly enough to be fordable but deep enough to slow any crossing force and make them vulnerable to enemy fire. The banks were steep but not insurmountable. Most critically, a small grove of trees on the far side would provide some concealment for the initial assault troops. Pohlmann had positioned his artillery to command the obvious crossing points upstream, but the junction of the two rivers, the target of Wellesley's attack, was protected by only a single battery of guns and perhaps 2 battalions of infantry. It was the weakest point in an otherwise formidable defensive line, and Wellesley intended to hit it with everything he had. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the British force began its approach march. To any observer, it would have appeared to be a conventional advance toward the main Maratha position, exactly what Pohlmann expected and had prepared to receive. The redcoats marched in column through the dusty countryside, their regimental colors flying, their officers mounted and conspicuous in their blue and gold uniforms. But this was misdirection on a grand scale. As the main column approached the obvious crossing point, a smaller force under Wellesley's personal command was moving through dead ground toward the river junction, hidden from enemy observation by carefully chosen terrain features and the natural haze of an Indian morning. The success of the entire plan hinged on this deception. If Pohlmann detected the true axis of attack too early, he could redeploy his artillery and concentrate his infantry to meet the threat. The mathematical advantage that already favored the Marathas would become overwhelming, and the British force would be destroyed before it could even establish a foothold across the river. Wellesley's timing had to be perfect. At 11:30, the British advance guard reached the banks of the Kaitna River at the junction point. Enemy sentries had spotted their approach, but the smallness of the force suggested a reconnaissance in strength rather than a main assault. A few scattered shots rang out from the far bank, but no general alarm was raised. This was the moment of truth. Once the river crossing began, there would be no turning back. The British force would be committed to battle against odds that would have given pause to Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar. Everything would depend on speed, surprise, and the fighting quality of soldiers who had already proven themselves across thousands of miles of Indian campaigning. Wellesley gave the signal, and the 74th Highland Regiment stepped into the muddy waters of the Kaitna. What followed was one of the most extraordinary river crossings in military history. The Highlanders, weighed down by their full kit and ammunition, struggled across the slow-moving current while enemy fire began to intensify from the far bank. Men stumbled and fell, their muskets held high to keep the powder dry. Officers shouted encouragement and orders that were barely audible above the growing din of battle. Behind the 74th came the Sepoy battalions, their British officers leading from the front, their native non-commissioned officers maintaining the rigid discipline that had been drilled into them through months of training. These men were crossing more than just a river. They were crossing a threshold between the familiar world of garrison duty and parade ground drill and the ultimate test of battlefield courage. The Maratha defenders, initially confused by the unexpected direction of attack, began to react with increasing urgency. Artillery pieces that had been trained on other sectors wheeled around to engage the river crossing. Infantry battalions began moving toward the threatened point, their officers recognizing that something more than a reconnaissance was developing. But Pohlmann's response, though swift, was not swift enough. The British assault had achieved that most precious of military advantages: surprise at the point of contact. By the time enemy reinforcements could arrive, Wellesley intended to have his entire force across the river and formed up for the main attack. The 78th Highland Regiment followed the 74th across the Kaitna, their pipes playing the regimental march even as enemy round shot began to tear through their ranks. These were men from the hills and islands of Scotland, many of them fighting their first major action in India, all of them supremely confident in their ability to close with any enemy and settle the matter with bayonet and steel. The sepoy battalions crossed last, their performance watched carefully by European officers who still harbored doubts about native reliability under extreme pressure. But the Indian soldiers moved with the same steady determination as their Highland comrades, maintaining formation despite the growing intensity of enemy fire, proving once again that courage is not the monopoly of any single race or nation. By 1215, the entire British force was across the Kaitna River and beginning to deploy for the assault on the Maratha line. They had achieved the impossible, a successful river crossing in the face of enemy fire. But the real test was yet to come. Poleman, watching from his command position, could hardly believe what he was seeing. A British force of barely 3,000 men had not only crossed a defended river, but was now forming up for what appeared to be a direct assault on his main line. The mathematical impossibility of the situation was so stark that he initially suspected some kind of elaborate deception. Perhaps this was a diversion while the main British force attacked elsewhere. But reconnaissance quickly confirmed the reality. This was the entire British army, and it was preparing to attack his 30,000 men with less than 3,000 of their own. "Magnificent," he reportedly murmured to his staff, "but it is madness." He wasn't wrong about the magnificence. What Wellesley had accomplished in getting his force across the river and deployed for battle represented military execution of the highest order. Every movement had been timed to perfection, every unit had performed exactly as planned, and the element of surprise had been maintained until the critical moment. But Poleman wasn't wrong about the madness either. Even with the river crossing complete, the British force still faced odds of more than 10 to 1. They were about to assault a prepared defensive position held by disciplined troops, supported by superior artillery. Mathematical logic suggested that the attack would be repulsed with devastating losses, leaving the survivors trapped against the river they had just crossed. What Poleman didn't fully understand, what no one could have understood without seeing it executed, was the tactical brilliance of Wellesley's deployment. The British commander had positioned his force not for a conventional frontal assault, but for something far more sophisticated. A combined arms attack that would concentrate maximum firepower at the weakest point in the enemy line, while using terrain features to minimize the defenders' numerical advantage. The 74th Highland Regiment formed the right wing of the assault, their objective the village of Assai itself. If they could seize and hold this position, they would anchor the entire British line and provide a base of operations for further advances. The 78th Highland Regiment and the Sepoy battalions formed the center and left, their mission to punch through the Maratha line at the river junction and then wheel to roll up the enemy position from the flank. It was a maneuver that required precise timing and extraordinary courage, but it offered the only realistic hope of turning numerical disadvantage into tactical victory. The British artillery, all 17 pieces of it, unlimbered in carefully chosen positions that would provide maximum support for the infantry assault while remaining protected from counter-battery fire. Every gun would count in the coming engagement, and Wellesley had positioned them with the mathematical precision of an artillery officer who understood that superior technique could sometimes offset inferior numbers. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, with the Indian sun blazing overhead and the temperature soaring past 100 degrees, Arthur Wellesley gave the order that would determine the fate of British India. "Advance!" The sound that arose from the British line was unlike anything heard on Indian battlefields before or since. The pipes of the Highland regiments wailed their ancient battle tunes while the Sepoy battalions stepped off to the beat of British drums. 3,000 voices raised the battle cry that had echoed across battlefields from Flanders to Egypt, a sound that somehow managed to be both defiant and confident despite the overwhelming odds. The advance across the open ground between the river and the Maratha position was a study in controlled violence. The British line moved with clockwork precision, maintaining formation despite the growing intensity of enemy fire, closing the distance with the methodical determination that had made European infantry masters of the battlefield. Enemy artillery, initially surprised by the unexpected direction of attack, began to find the range. Round shot tore through the advancing ranks, leaving gaps that were immediately filled by men stepping in from the rear. The mathematical logic of the situation suggested that the British line should have disintegrated under this punishment, but military mathematics don't account for the kind of disciplined courage that these men had developed through years of campaigning. At 200 yards from the enemy line, Wellesley gave the signal for the final assault. The British force broke into the double quick, covering the remaining distance at a run that left no time for enemy gunners to reload. Bayonets were fixed, muskets primed, and 3,000 voices raised in a cheer that could be heard above the thunder of artillery. The collision, when it came, was spectacular in its violence and decisive in its results. The 74th Highland Regiment struck the village of Assai like a human battering ram, their charge carrying them over the makeshift barricades and into hand-to-hand combat with Maratha defenders who fought with desperate courage but could not match the disciplined ferocity of Scottish soldiers fighting for their lives. House-to-house combat raged through the narrow streets, with bayonet and tulwar settling disputes that musket and cannon had begun. The center and left of the British line achieved something that military theorists would study for generations: a successful breakthrough against a prepared position held by vastly superior numbers. The sepoy battalions, fighting alongside their Highland comrades, punched through the Maratha line at the exact point where Wellesley had predicted it would be weakest, then began the complex maneuver song of wheeling to attack the enemy position from the flank. But success brought its own dangers. The breakthrough had created a salient that was vulnerable to counterattack from three sides. Pohlman, recognizing the threat to his position, began moving reserves to contain the British penetration and potentially cut off the assault force from their river crossing. This was the moment when tactical brilliance would either pay dividends or result in catastrophic failure. Wellesley had gambled everything on the proposition that disciplined European troops could create enough confusion in the enemy ranks to offset their numerical disadvantage. If his calculation was wrong, if Pohlman could coordinate an effective counterattack, the entire British force would be destroyed within sight of the river they had crossed just hours before. The fighting that raged for the next 2 hours was some of the most intense and confused in the history of colonial warfare. British and Maratha forces were intermixed across a battlefield that stretched for miles, with individual units fighting desperate actions that would determine the fate of the larger engagement. Command and control broke down as officers fell and units became separated in the chaos of battle. In the village of Assai, the 74th Highland Regiment fought a series of savage actions that left entire streets littered with casualties from both sides. The Marathas, fighting on home ground with everything to lose, contested every building and every intersection with a courage that earned the respect of their Scottish opponents. But discipline and training began to tell, and by mid-afternoon the Highlanders had secured their primary objective. On the left flank, the sepoy battalions were proving once and for all that native troops could match European soldiers in courage and determination when properly led and motivated. Fighting alongside the 78th Highland Regiment, they had not only maintained their formation under intense pressure, but had actually advanced beyond their initial objectives, capturing enemy artillery pieces and turning them against their former owners. But it was in the center of the battlefield where the outcome was really being decided. Here, Wellesley himself led a charge that would become legendary in British military history. A mounted assault against a Maratha battery that had been decimating his advancing infantry. Picture this scene: a British general on horseback, his uniform torn by enemy fire, leading a handful of men in a direct assault against artillery pieces that are firing into their faces. The mathematical calculation is simple and brutal: horses and men against cannons loaded with grape shot. The odds of survival are minimal, the chances of success almost non-existent. But sometimes courage and leadership can achieve what mathematics declares impossible. Wellesley's charge overran the battery, capturing the guns and creating a gap in the enemy line that his infantry immediately exploited. The psychological effect was enormous. If the British commander was willing to risk everything in personal combat, his men would follow him anywhere. More importantly, the capture of the battery had created exactly the kind of tactical opportunity that Wellesley had been hoping for since the battle began. With enemy artillery neutralized at the critical point, his infantry could advance without facing the devastating fire that had been holding them back. The breakthrough that had seemed mathematically impossible was suddenly achievable. But Pohlmann was far from finished. The German commander had been moving reserves throughout the battle, and now he launched a counterattack designed to exploit what he perceived as British overextension. Fresh Maratha battalions, supported by cavalry and the remaining artillery, struck at the extended British line with the kind of coordinated assault that should have been overwhelming. This was the crisis point of the entire engagement. The British force, already committed beyond any reasonable margin of safety, now faced a coordinated enemy assault that threatened to cut their line in half and destroy them piecemeal. Mathematics and military logic both suggested that this would be the end of Wellesley's audacious gamble. Instead, it became the moment when tactical genius achieved its fullest expression. Rather than trying to meet the Maratha counterattack head-on, Wellesley executed a maneuver that would be studied in military academies for centuries afterward. He ordered his center to give ground while his flanks held firm, creating a tactical situation where the advancing enemy forces would be drawn into a killing ground where British firepower could be concentrated from multiple directions. It was a calculated risk that required extraordinary confidence in his men's ability to execute complex maneuvers under extreme pressure. A controlled withdrawal in the face of enemy assault is one of the most difficult operations in warfare, demanding the kind of discipline and trust that can only be developed through shared hardship and proven leadership. The sepoy battalions, fighting their first major action but trained to British standards, executed the withdrawal with textbook precision. The Highland regiments, drawing on centuries of military tradition, fell back in good order while maintaining continuous fire. Most critically, the British artillery, those precious 17 guns, continued to function as a coordinated battery, concentrating their fire on the advancing Maratha formations with devastating effect. The result was exactly what Wellesley had calculated. The Maratha counterattack, launched with such promise and coordinated with such skill, broke apart under concentrated British fire before it could achieve decisive results. Enemy battalions that had advanced with confidence found themselves isolated and vulnerable, taking casualties from multiple directions while unable to close effectively with their tormentors. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the tide of battle had turned decisively in Britain's favor. Pohlmann, recognizing that his counterattack had failed and that his position was becoming untenable, began ordering a general withdrawal. It was a decision that saved what remained of his army, but acknowledged that the impossible had indeed occurred. A British force of 2,800 men had defeated a Maratha army of 30,000, achieving victory through tactical brilliance, extraordinary courage, and the kind of military execution that occurs perhaps once in a generation. But the true measure of Wellesley's achievement went far beyond the immediate tactical success. The Battle of Assay had fundamentally altered the strategic balance in India, demonstrating that European military science, properly applied, could overcome enormous numerical disadvantages. More importantly, it had shown that British forces could achieve decisive victories even when operating far from their bases of support, deep in hostile territory against sophisticated opponents. The immediate aftermath of the battle painted a stark picture of its intensity. British casualties totaled nearly 1,600 men, more than half the original force, a testament to the savagery of the fighting and the courage of the Maratha defenders. Among the dead were some of the finest officers in the British Army, men whose loss would be felt for years to come. Maratha casualties were even more severe, with estimates ranging upward of 6,000 killed and wounded. Entire battalions had been destroyed, artillery pieces captured or abandoned, and the psychological impact of defeat had shattered the morale of forces that had considered themselves invincible. But numbers alone cannot convey the true significance of what had occurred on the plains near Assai. For the first time since arriving in India, the East India Company had demonstrated that it could face the very best that indigenous military science could offer and emerge victorious. The myth of Maratha invincibility had been shattered, and with it the last serious hope of rolling back British expansion through military means. Pohlmann himself, in his after-action report to Scindia, captured the magnitude of the defeat with characteristic Germanic precision. The British fought like devils incarnate. I have never seen such discipline under fire, such coordination under pressure. They should have been destroyed 10 times over, but somehow they made the mathematics work in their favor. News of the victory spread across India with the speed of modern communications, carried by the network of spies, merchants, and officials that connected every corner of the subcontinent. In Calcutta, Governor-General Richard Wellesley received the dispatch announcing his brother's victory with a mixture of relief and amazement. The entire future of British India had been hanging in the balance, and Arthur had somehow pulled success from the jaws of what should have been certain defeat. In London, when news of Assaye finally arrived months later, the reaction was more complex. The Court of Directors of the East India Company were pleased with the strategic results, but horrified by the casualties and the enormous risks that had been taken. Military experts studied the battle reports with fascination and bewilderment, unable to quite understand how such a small force had achieved such decisive results against such overwhelming odds. The Duke of York, Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, reportedly remarked that young Wellesley has either lost his mind or discovered something about warfare that the rest of us have yet to understand. History would eventually prove that it was the latter. But perhaps the most significant reaction came from the soldiers themselves, both British and Indian, who had fought in the battle. They had discovered something about their own capabilities that would transform their understanding of what was possible in military affairs. They had learned that courage, discipline, and tactical skill could sometimes overcome mathematical impossibility, that leadership could make the difference between victory and disaster, even under the most adverse circumstances. The sepoy battalions, in particular, had proven something that would reshape British military thinking for generations. Native troops, properly trained and led, could match European soldiers in courage and effectiveness. The old assumptions about racial superiority in military affairs had been shattered as decisively as Scindia's army, opening the door to a new era of colonial military organization. Arthur Wellesley himself seemed almost surprised by the magnitude of his achievement. In his official dispatch to Calcutta, he wrote with characteristic understatement, "The affair was long and doubtful, and I should not like to see again such loss as I sustained on the 23rd of September, even if attended by such gain." It was a remarkably modest assessment of what many military historians consider one of the most brilliant tactical victories in British military history. But then, Wellesley was never one for grandiose self-promotion. He understood that while tactics had won the day at Assaye, strategy would determine the ultimate fate of British India. The immediate strategic consequences of the victory were profound and lasting. Scindia, his main army shattered and his most experienced commander defeated, was forced to seek terms with the British. The Treaty of Surji-Anjangaon, signed just months after Assaye, ceded vast territories to British control and effectively ended Maratha power as a serious threat to company interests. Other potential enemies across India took note of what had happened on the plains near Assai. Native princes who had been considering resistance to British expansion suddenly found diplomatic solutions far more attractive than military ones. The message was clear. Even the most sophisticated indigenous armies could not stand against British tactical superiority when that superiority was applied with sufficient skill and determination. But the true significance of Assaye went far beyond its immediate political and military consequences. The battle marked a fundamental turning point in the nature of colonial warfare, demonstrating that European military science had evolved to the point where it could overcome virtually any numerical disadvantage when properly applied. This was not simply a matter of superior weapons or equipment. The Marathas had possessed artillery comparable to the British, and their infantry was trained to European standards. Rather, it was a question of tactical innovation, operational planning, and the kind of military leadership that could inspire men to achieve the impossible. Wellesley had shown that colonial warfare was evolving into something far more sophisticated than the simple application of superior firepower against poorly organized opponents. The enemies that Britain faced in India were becoming more professional, more tactically aware, and more capable of matching European military techniques. Victory would increasingly depend on superior generalship rather than superior technology. The lessons of Assai would influence British military thinking for decades to come. The emphasis on aggressive offensive action, the willingness to accept tactical risks in pursuit of strategic objectives, and the confidence that disciplined troops could overcome enormous numerical disadvantages became hallmarks of British colonial military doctrine. Most importantly, the battle established Arthur Wellesley as one of the premier military commanders of his generation. The same tactical brilliance that had overcome the odds at Assaye would later manifest itself on the battlefields of Spain and Portugal, where Wellesley, by then the Duke of Wellington, would demonstrate that French military superiority was no more invincible than Maratha numerical advantage had been. The Peninsular Campaign, which would make Wellington's reputation across Europe, was in many ways an extension of the principles he had first applied on the plains of India. The same willingness to take calculated risks, the same confidence in the fighting quality of well-led troops, and the same ability to identify and exploit enemy weaknesses would characterize his campaigns against Napoleon's marshals. And ultimately, it was at Waterloo that the tactical lessons learned at Assaye would achieve their fullest expression. The same commander who had defeated 30,000 Marathas with 2,800 men would face Napoleon himself with an allied army that was outnumbered and outgunned, achieving victory through superior positioning, tactical flexibility, and the kind of defensive fighting that had first been perfected in the dust and heat of central India. Yet for all its historical significance, the Battle of Assaye remains curiously forgotten in popular memory. While Waterloo is remembered as one of the decisive engagements of world history, Assaye is relegated to the footnotes of colonial history, remembered mainly by military specialists and students of Indian affairs. This historical amnesia is both unfortunate and revealing. Unfortunate because Assaye represents military achievement of the highest order, a victory that rivals any in the annals of British arms. Revealing because it demonstrates how colonial warfare, no matter how brilliant or significant, tends to be overshadowed by European campaigns in the popular imagination. But you need to understand what was really at stake on that dusty plain in central India. This wasn't just another colonial skirmish between imperial powers and local rulers. The fate of British India, and with it, the entire future of the British Empire, hung in the balance. If Wellesley had failed, if the mathematics of warfare had worked out as they should have, the consequences would have reverberated around the world. A British defeat at Assaye would have encouraged Maratha resistance across India, potentially sparking a general uprising that could have driven European forces from the subcontinent entirely. The enormous wealth that flowed from India to Britain, wealth that funded the Royal Navy, sustained British resistance to Napoleon, and financed the industrial development that would make Britain the workshop of the world, would have been cut off at its source. The global balance of power in the early 19th century might have shifted dramatically, with profound consequences for the development of the modern world. Without Indian wealth and manpower, Britain's ability to resist French hegemony in Europe would have been severely compromised. The coalition wars against Napoleon might have ended differently, reshaping the political development of Europe for generations. Instead, Wellesley's victory ensured that British power in India would continue to grow unchecked for another century and a half. The wealth and resources of the subcontinent would continue to flow to London, funding British global dominance and enabling the expansion of empire across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. From an Indian perspective, Assay marked the end of the last serious indigenous challenge to British expansion. The Maratha confederacy had represented the final hope for maintaining political independence in the face of European expansion. With its defeat, the subcontinent was effectively divided between areas under direct British control and nominally independent princely states that existed only at British sufferance. The human cost of this transformation was enormous and is still being calculated by historians. British victory at Assay enabled the expansion of a colonial system that would extract vast wealth from India while leaving much of the population in poverty. The political fragmentation that followed the defeat of indigenous resistance would contribute to the communal tensions that eventually led to the partition of the subcontinent and the displacement of millions. Yet even acknowledging these consequences, it's impossible not to admire the purely military achievement that Wellesley accomplished on September 23, 1803. Stripped of its political and imperial context, Assay represents tactical brilliance of the highest order, a victory achieved through superior planning, flawless execution, and extraordinary personal courage. The mathematical impossibility of the situation makes the achievement all the more remarkable. In an age when military theorists were beginning to understand warfare as a science governed by quantifiable principles, Wellesley demonstrated that human factors, leadership, morale, tactical innovation, could still override mathematical logic when applied with sufficient skill. This is perhaps the most important lesson of Assay for modern students of military affairs. Technology and numbers matter enormously in warfare, but they are not everything. Superior leadership, better training, and tactical innovation can sometimes overcome even overwhelming material disadvantages. The principles that Wellesley applied at Assay, concentration of force at the decisive point, speed of action to achieve surprise, aggressive offensive tactics to seize the initiative, remain relevant to military thinking today. The specific techniques may have evolved with changes in technology and doctrine, but the underlying concepts continue to influence military planning and execution around the world. Perhaps most importantly, Assay demonstrates the crucial role of individual leadership in determining the outcome of military campaigns. Without Wellesley's tactical vision, personal courage, and ability to inspire confidence in his men, the British force would almost certainly have been destroyed. The difference between victory and disaster often comes down to the quality of command at the critical moment. This lesson has profound implications beyond purely military affairs. In any field where individuals must work together under pressure to achieve difficult objectives, whether in business, politics, or social movements, the quality of leadership often determines the difference between success and failure. The men who fought at Assay, both British and Indian, demonstrated another timeless principle, that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when properly led and motivated. The sepoys who crossed the Kaitna River under fire were not professional soldiers in the European sense, but farmers and craftsmen who had been trained to military discipline. The Highland regiments were drawn from some of the poorest regions of Scotland, men who had enlisted primarily for economic reasons rather than patriotic fervor. Yet under pressure, these men displayed the kind of courage and determination that military theorists spend lifetimes trying to understand and replicate. They proved that the capacity for heroism exists in every society and every social class, waiting to be awakened by the right combination of leadership, training, and purpose. This is perhaps the most inspiring aspect of the Assaye story. It reminds us that human potential often exceeds our mathematical calculations, that individuals and groups can sometimes achieve far more than statistical analysis would suggest possible. But we must also remember the cost of such achievements. The casualty lists from Assay tell their own story of sacrifice and loss. More than half the men who crossed the Kaitna River that morning were killed or wounded before the day was over. Behind every statistical victory lies a human story of families shattered, dreams ended, and potential unfulfilled. Modern military historians sometimes debate whether Wellesley's tactics at Assay were brilliant or simply reckless, whether the victory justified the enormous risks taken and the heavy casualties sustained. It's a legitimate question that goes to the heart of military ethics and the responsibilities of command. From a purely strategic perspective, the answer seems clear. The risks Wellesley took were justified by the stakes involved and the lack of viable alternatives. Conventional tactics offered no hope of victory against such overwhelming odds, while retreat would have meant strategic defeat across the entire theater of operations. But from a human perspective, the calculation is more complex. Could the same strategic objectives have been achieved through different means, perhaps at lower cost in human suffering? Was the immediate tactical victory worth the long-term consequences for Indian society and politics? These are questions that each generation must answer for itself, based on its own understanding of military necessity, political morality, and human values. What seems certain is that the Battle of Assay will continue to generate debate and discussion among military historians, political scientists, and moral philosophers for generations to come. What cannot be debated is the extraordinary nature of the military achievement itself. By any standard of measurement, tactical innovation, operational execution, strategic consequences, Assay ranks among the most remarkable victories in military history. It deserves to be remembered not just as a footnote to colonial history, but as an example of what human courage and ingenuity can accomplish under the most adverse circumstances. The story of Assay also reminds us of the complexity and contingency of historical development. Small events, a single battle fought by a few thousand men in a remote corner of India, can have consequences that reshape the world. The decisions made by individuals in moments of crisis can determine the fate of nations and empires. Arthur Wellesley's choice to cross the Kaitna River and attack an enemy force 10 times larger than his own was made in an instant, based on incomplete information and under enormous pressure. Yet that single decision helped determine the future of British India, the balance of power in Europe, and the development of the modern world system. It's a sobering reminder of how much of history depends on individual choices made under pressure by people who cannot fully foresee the consequences of their actions. The weight of responsibility that such individuals carry is almost impossible to imagine, yet somehow they find the courage to act decisively when action is required. Perhaps this is the ultimate lesson of Assay, that history is made by individuals who are willing to take responsibility for their actions and accept the consequences of their decisions, regardless of the odds they face or the criticism they might endure. In an age that sometimes seems to value consensus over leadership and caution over courage, the example of men who are willing to stake everything on their judgment remains both inspiring and instructive. The Battle of Assay ended on the afternoon of September 23, 1803, but its consequences continue to unfold even today. Every time military commanders study the principles of tactical innovation, every time political leaders weigh the risks and benefits of decisive action, every time individuals face seemingly impossible odds and choose to persevere rather than surrender, the spirit of Assay lives on. That may be the most fitting memorial to the men who fought and died on that dusty plain in central India more than 2 centuries ago. Their courage and sacrifice achieved something that mathematics declared impossible: proving once again that human potential often exceeds our ability to measure or predict it. In the end, the story of the general who beat 30,000 with 2,800 is not just a tale of military history, but a testament to the power of human will when directed by skilled leadership toward a worthy objective. It reminds us that the impossible is sometimes just the improbable waiting for the right person at the right moment to make it reality. And that, perhaps, is why we still tell this story more than 200 years later, and why we will continue telling it for generations yet to come. The mathematics of warfare may be complex, but the mathematics of human courage are simpler. One person, willing to lead, multiplied by others willing to follow, can sometimes equal victory against any odds. Arthur Wellesley proved that equation at Assay, and in doing so, he changed the world.